My name's Juliette Gerard, and for the last 6 years, I was the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor. I'm now returned to the University of Auckland, and I'm taking some time to learn the lessons from that period, advising 3 Prime Ministers. So science advice may be used well or misused or completely ignored. And looking at all the projects that we did over the 6 years, they really sit on a spectrum. At one end, we have the plastics report, where the politicians and the policymakers had rethinking plastics and what to do about the pollution problem high on the policy agenda. That one was pretty successful. All our recommendations got adopted, and we got a shout out in the speech from the throne in 2020. At the other end of the spectrum, we did a report on understanding how to minimise harm from gangs. That one was not quite so well received. It was commissioned by one Prime Minister, landed on the desk of another Prime Minister, by which time the policy agenda had shifted. And I've used a GIF to avoid being disrespectful to summarise the government response. Worse than that, the then leader of the opposition, who shortly afterwards became my boss, dismissed it soundly on national radio. So what can we learn from these 2 case studies and all the other things we did about how to make science advice more effective in future? So I hinted that understanding the policy agenda was important. And if you're at that sweet spot where you're just ahead of the politicians and the policymakers who are thirsty for evidence on a topic, then it's more likely that the report will land well. But there's more to it than that. It's not just about minds, it's also about hearts. So one of the things that we've been reflecting on is how to think about not just scientific evidence, but also where people's values lie on a particular topic. And I've summarised these on a little chart, which looks at hearts in terms of a values consensus, so is there polarisation, and minds in terms of a scientific consensus. So do all scientists agree? So to give you some examples, let's think about a tornado. If there's a tornado coming, there's a pretty strong consensus that we should get out of the way, we should stay safe, we should minimise harm. And there's a really high understanding in the scientific community and a consensus on the path of the tornado and how strong it's going to be. So then you're in the sweet spot, and it's likely that scientific advice will be useful. Contrast that to something like abortion, where the values debate, quite rightly, is going to really dominate people's thinking on the issue. And even if the scientists all agree, it's going to be really hard to get traction for an evidence base in that debate. Even harder, think about use recreationally of illegal drugs like ecstasy. Then you're in a really murky spot where there isn't much scientific evidence, partly because of the illegality, and the values positions are all over the place. And so while that might be questions that the politicians have, it's unlikely that your science advice is going to be clear-cut. And to complete the quadrant, imagine an asteroid is about to hit the Earth. I think we'd all agree we should probably do something about that, but the scientific consensus on what to do is going to be really hard to achieve. And I'm very glad I won't be the science advisor when that happens. So if you look at all those on the chart, then maybe you've got a tool in the consensus quadrant to think about where the question lies in terms of hearts and minds, and start to think about how to land your evidence within that values spectrum. So here's a sample of some of the projects that I did over the last 6 years with my team and expert panels. And you can see they're scattered all over the quadrant. And the ones in the top right-hand corner, including plastics, are the ones where there's a pretty clear consensus amongst scientists and a strong values consensus that means they're likely to land well. Of course, that quadrant isn't a static beast, and consensus isn't static in either dimension. So if you think about what happened in COVID, we started off in 2020 with a pretty strong values consensus that we should do something while we had very low understanding of the threat that we were facing. And ironically, as scientific understanding grew, then we lost some of that values consensus and started to see polarisation. So with hindsight, analysing where we'd got to in the quadrant might have been useful for getting advice on things like vaccines to land better. So why do we care about this? Well, I think as a research community, we have a lot of challenges ahead. So decision makers have different appetites for evidence. They go from very nerdy and wanting all the details through to Michael Gove. I've chosen an example for the UK for this one, who famously said that people had had enough of experts. Within that framing, as you get more Michael Goves being elected, then there's a risk that nobody asks for evidence. But we have to remember that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and think of creative ways to get information on to the political agenda. And that's my favourite quote from Donald Trump from the days of COVID, saying if we stop testing right now, we'd have few cases, if any. He's right, but maybe that's not the best way to manage a pandemic. And I think as a research community, we need to rise to the challenge of communicating complex and nuanced information against a geopolitical landscape that likes certainty, even if it's wrong. So there's a lovely quote there from Claire Craig in the UK explaining that when you talk to some ministers in particular, you need to be clear, concise, and not complicate things and emphasise uncertainty. And yet all those things are a critical part of the picture. So working out how to communicate those concepts when the competition, as I've illustrated on the right there, might be very sure, but also very wrong, is the challenge ahead. And maybe the consensus quadrant might provide one tool to do that. Thank you.